British soldiers in the World Wars weren't just fighting the enemy, they were fighting their own bodies. Men went days with almost no sleep until exhaustion blurred the line between reality and hallucination. Cold didn't just hurt, it slowly broke them down, destroying their feet before they even realized it. Hunger pushed them to eat whatever they could find, even when they knew it might make them sick. And the most dangerous part wasn't always the bullets. It was the waiting, the silence, the constant fear that never truly stopped. This wasn't a bad day. This was Thursday, just another normal day for a British soldier in a war zone. And Thursday looked like this. The ground beneath your boots is frozen solid. Your fingers stopped working 20 minutes ago. Not numb, just gone. Somewhere ahead, hidden in darkness, there's 70 meters of open ground and a man waiting to kill you. You haven't slept in 31 hours. Your last proper meal was a tin of beef that smelled wrong before you opened it, and you ate it anyway, because that's all there was. There was no alternative, no backup, no second option waiting somewhere safer. This wasn't rare, this was routine. And here's the part that still surprises historians. It's not that men broke under these conditions, it's that most of them didn't. They adapted, they improvised. They built their own systems of survival, systems that had nothing to do with official military doctrine and everything to do with experience, observation, and necessity. Because if you strip away the maps, the strategies, the heroic stories, what remains is something much more human. This isn't just a story about war, and it's a story about the body, about sleep deprivation so severe it causes hallucinations, about cold that quietly destroys judgment before you even feel it, about hunger, fear, and exhaustion, and the precise, often invisible ways ordinary men learn to manage all of it at once. Not the battles, but the time between them, the part no one writes about, the part that decided who lived and who didn't. Start with sleep, because once sleep begins to fail, everything else follows. In both world wars, frontline British soldiers often survived on just 3 to 5 hours of broken sleep per night. That's not just tiring. That's a full biological crisis. It means the body never fully recovers. The brain never fully resets. Fatigue accumulates hour by hour, day by day. After roughly 40 hours without proper rest, the human brain begins to shut down. Reaction time slows, judgment collapses, emotional control disappears. Men start seeing threats that aren't there and missing the ones that are. Small mistakes become deadly ones, and it didn't happen all at once. It built slowly. First, it was small things, forgetting simple instructions, reacting a second too late, struggling to focus on routine tasks. Then it became something more serious. The brain, deprived of rest, began to fill in gaps on its own. Shapes in the dark turned into movement. Sounds became imagined threats. A man could be fully awake and still not fully aware of what was real. And in a battlefield environment where every second matters, that kind of confusion wasn't just dangerous, it was deadly. And there were moments when soldiers fired into the darkness, at shapes that didn't exist, and sometimes at their own men. Not because they were careless, but because their brains were no longer processing reality correctly. The Army knew about this. Reports existed. Medical officers documented it. But institutionally, very little changed. So soldiers adapted on their own. A quiet system emerged, not written in any manual, not taught in training, but passed from one man to another as carefully as any weapon drill. Sleep whenever you can, anywhere you can, against a wall, inside a crater, sitting upright, lying in mud, during an artillery pause that might last 4 minutes or 40. Even a few minutes of real sleep could make a difference. New recruits were often shocked by how quickly experienced soldiers could fall asleep in conditions that felt completely impossible. Noise, cold, danger, it didn't matter. But this wasn't carelessness. It was discipline. A trained ability to shut the body down on command because the cost of staying awake was even greater. And then there was something even more important. Trust, not the official sentry system, but an informal agreement within small groups. Someone stays awake so others can truly sleep, not half sleep, not drifting in and out. Real rest. Because when you trust the man next to you, you can close your eyes without fear. And when you can sleep, even briefly, you can function. And when you can function, you stay alive. Now consider something slower, but just as dangerous. Cold. Cold doesn't strike like a bullet. It doesn't arrive all at once. It works gradually, quietly. It begins at the extremities, your fingers, your toes, your ears, and moves inward so slowly that soldiers often didn't realize how compromised they already were until it was too late. That's what made it dangerous. The standard uniforms weren't designed for this kind of environment. Wool jackets, leather boots, materials suited for movement, not for standing still in freezing, waterlogged trenches for hours at a time. So again, survival depended on adaptation. The item that saved countless lives wasn't official equipment, it was something crude. A goatskin jerkin, ugly, heavy, unevenly distributed, often overlooked by command, but incredibly effective. Men traded for them, hoarded them, passed them down like inheritance from one soldier to another. Or because in winter, a jerkin could mean the difference between endurance and collapse. It trapped heat around the body's core, protected vital organs, and unlike wool, it didn't lose its insulating power when wet. But the cold that caused the most damage wasn't the one you felt immediately. It was the one that stayed. Trench foot, feet constantly exposed to cold and moisture begin to break down. The skin softens, tissue weakens, blood circulation is reduced, infection spreads silently. At first it might seem minor, just discomfort, just numbness, but it progresses. In severe cases, gangrene. Men didn't just suffer, they lost feet, they lost legs. And the solution, when it finally became standard, was almost insultingly simple. Dry socks, regularly changed, combined with oil rubbed into the feet before replacing them. And that was it. But it took thousands of casualties before this became enforced policy across units. And even then, it relied on something else. Other people. Because early trench foot can't always be felt by the person experiencing it. So soldiers checked each other's feet, watched for signs, intervened early. What made it even worse was how normal it began to feel. Soldiers often ignored the early signs because discomfort was constant anyway. Wet feet, numb toes, aching skin, it all blended into the background of daily life. By the time the damage became visible, it was often too late to reverse. This is why constant checking became essential, not just as routine, but as survival. Again,
Stay close.
survival wasn't individual, it was
help.
shared.
Thanks.
Now think about food. On paper, British soldiers were meant to receive around 3,500 calories per day. Enough in theory to sustain heavy physical activity. In reality, often far less. Supply lines broke, ration carriers were shelled, deliveries never arrived, food spoiled before it reached the front, and a soldier burning 4,000 to 5,000 calories a day, while digging, carrying equipment, and enduring extreme stress. On barely half that intake, isn't just hungry, he's deteriorating. His body begins consuming its own reserves. Muscle breaks down, energy drops, thinking slows, reactions weaken. So once again, soldiers adapted. They built an informal system of survival. They foraged, traded with civilians when possible, experimented with whatever they had. Hard biscuits soaked in water, then fried in scraps of fat to make them edible. Tea brewed in a mess tin, over a candle or small flame. Preserved meat stretched across more men than it was meant for, divided carefully to last longer. There was even a phrase for it, making do. It sounds simple, almost casual, but it described an entire survival philosophy, something no official training could teach, because it was learned the hardest way possible, through experience, through scarcity, through necessity. And one thing mattered more than anything else, hot food, not just for calories, but for morale. Medical officers noticed it repeatedly. Units that received hot meals, even occasionally, performed better, physically, mentally, socially, because heat, even in food, sends a powerful signal. It tells the body, you're being cared for. And in conditions where almost everything else is failing, that signal matters more than logic would suggest. And then there was something even harder to manage. Fear. Not the sharp, immediate fear of incoming fire. That kind of fear has direction. It has a source. You can respond to it. The real damage came from something else. Waiting, not knowing, the silence between shelling, the uncertainty of whether the next explosion comes in 30 seconds, or hours, or not at all. That kind of uncertainty doesn't fade, it stays, and over time, it changes the brain. What the First World War called shell shock wasn't weakness, it was damage. The result of prolonged, uncontrollable stress acting on the nervous system over weeks and months. The Army didn't fully understand it, and in many cases, responded poorly. Men were punished, court-martialed, labeled as cowards, when in reality, many of them were experiencing complete psychological collapse. But once again, at the level of small groups, a different system emerged, unofficial, unwritten, but effective. Men looked after each other. They kept distressed soldiers occupied, gave them simple tasks, stayed physically close so no one was isolated, and they talked. Not about the fear itself, but about anything else. Home, food, football, ordinary conversations that grounded the mind and prevented it from spiraling into panic. It wasn't therapy. It wasn't recognized as treatment, but it worked. Because the most resilient soldiers weren't the ones who felt no fear. They were the ones who weren't alone in it. So step back and look at what we've actually seen. Sleep, cold, hunger, fear. None of these survival systems came from official doctrine. None were taught in training academies. They were built by ordinary men, under extraordinary pressure, learning in real time. And this is what makes their survival so remarkable. Not just the scale of what they endured, but the way they adapted to it in real time. There was no perfect system, no guaranteed method, only small improvements shared between men, repeated again and again until they became instinct. Each lesson learned often came at a cost, and each technique carried the memory of someone who didn't make it. The Army itself was structured, rigid, built on hierarchy and control. But inside that structure, something else was always operating. A living system of knowledge, passed from one person to another, constantly evolving. Updated by those who had survived the longest. The soldiers who made it through weren't just braver, they were better informed, because someone showed them what to do. Change your socks, sleep in turns, stretch your rations, check your mate, simple knowledge. But in those conditions, it meant everything. Sometimes, more than courage itself. This is what daily survival in war really looked like. Not dramatic heroism, but something quieter, something relentless. The constant, exhausting, deeply human effort of staying alive. 1 hour at a time. And if you think this is where the story ends, it doesn't, because survival wasn't just about the body. Next, we look at something just as surprising. How soldiers dealt with illness at the front, and why the systems that saved the most lives were often the ones that bypassed official rules entirely.